Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Introduction to Scanning Part 2. We heard your feedback and you wanted more from Stuart, so he is back to give us some more information. And we're very excited that he is here today to expand on his previous presentation for us. Just a few housekeeping items. Today's meeting is being recorded, and we have also enabled live transcription. So if you'd like to see closed captioning during the presentation, go ahead and click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. It might also say CC on it. Please be aware that they are automated, so there may be some errors there. But otherwise, if you don't want the captions and you're seeing them, you can also turn them off on that same button. Additionally, Stuart will be answering all questions at the end of the presentation. However, feel free to post your question in the chat box at any time during the presentation, so you don't have to save them until the very end, but he will be answering them all at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Stuart, and he is the studio manager at the Digital Library Center at Florida State University. So go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Kayla. And hey, everybody, and thanks again for coming back and checking out this part 2 to the Introduction to Scanning presentation. Yeah, like Kayla said, the transcript might have some errors, and I realized part of that's probably because I have a little bit of a weird accent. So hopefully I'll try to enunciate as much as possible, and hopefully that comes through. Also, a quick side note, I do have a yellow jacket buzzing around in my room, in my office. So if I run around screaming and slapping around, it's because I got stung by a yellow jacket. But I'll try to be as calm as possible. But yeah, so oh yeah, also like Kayla said, we do have some time at the end for questions, so I'll try to finish with 15 to 10 minutes for questions. But at the very end, I have my contact information right here and on the final slide, and I would love to chat with any of y'all individually if we don't cover what you're looking for today, because like y'all know, there's a lot that goes into all of this. An introduction to scanning can cover a whole lot of different areas. So it's hard to cover everything in a 1-hour presentation, but please get in touch and I would love to set up a call or a meeting with any of y'all afterwards. So yeah, Introduction to Scanning Part 2. Let's see if I could do this here. All right, yeah. So brief introduction, that's me over there, Stuart Rochford, the Digital Library Center Studio Manager at Florida State University Libraries. We digitize primarily special collections material, and we do patron requests for researchers once in a while, just the general research community. It's not only FSU, it's pretty much everybody, all different sides. We do a lot of outreach and training as well, like this one here. I also do some basic metadata work. The studio setup, just a little background, I know we talked about this last time, but a little refresher is we are using a few Epson FLATBED scanners, the 12,000 XL series, which allows us to do film as well as reflective material. We have attendees Book Drive Pro, which handles our books, Phase 1 IQ1 8 which is a medium format overhead camera, and that handles our oversized items as well as some book objects. And that's probably the piece of equipment that we use the most. And we'll talk about this equipment later on in depth. All right, and a couple of document scanners. We're trying to, we don't really use those much just because the nature of our work being special collections material. These document sheet feed scanners can tear up paper material. So we don't really use them for much. They're mostly used for in-house material. But anyways, with all that being said, let's get started right away. Part 2. This is going to be just a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing. So we'll talk about some scanning, some photography, different types of material, including problematic material. There's all different issues that pop up. I'm sure you all are familiar with a wide array of issues. And file management. We're going to talk a little bit about file naming conventions, file management in general, and we'll try to get through as much as possible. So yeah, let's see what we got next. All right, I'll fly through this pretty quick. Y'all probably know a lot of this already, but cameras versus scanners, they both have their place in a digital production studio, given that you have space and budget and training to use them. So the benefits of cameras are that they are pretty versatile. They can handle a lot of the same stuff that scanners can handle, but they do have the added ability of being super fast. They capture really quick. We do have a lot more lighting options. You can zoom in and out, which you typically cannot do in a flatbed situation. And they are better suited for handling oversized items, since you can potentially zoom up as high as you want, as high as the ceiling, if there is one in your office. And 3D objects is another good type of material camera can handle. They can handle 3D objects and artifacts, whereas scanners not so good for that, for obvious reasons. Battery powered and portable, so you can take them into the field, you can take them to museums, different institutions if you need to. If you need to bring your equipment with you, they are battery powered, of course, and you can still work with a laptop and set up shop anywhere. Scanner benefits, they can get super high resolution with a lot lower cost when compared to cameras, and they have a nice little lid that they can lay the objects flat, which is good for wrinkled or curling pages, like negatives, film, or just any kind of old paper. They are super easy to use compared to cameras. The learning curve is a lot less steep, and it's good for setting up part-time workers or staff who might not have extensive training in digitization. So it's basically plug and play, push a button, and you can scan. So that's one of the benefits. There's a lot of free software options as well. And you do have controlled lighting, so you're not getting a lot of variables from windows or overhead lighting. So control lighting is good, and they're low maintenance. You don't have to worry too much about dust getting on your sensors and wires going bad and tethering issues. So those are basic benefits, and now we'll talk about some drawbacks. A lot of them, there is some overlap. The cameras, they are very complicated compared to scanners. They do have a lot more variables, a lot more moving parts. They do usually typically offer a lower resolution when compared to scanners at a similar price point. You can get higher resolution, but then, yeah, you're paying quite a bit for those fancy cameras. They are not as good for film, but I did put an asterisk there because you can, if you spend a lot of money, you can do pretty good scanning with cameras. If you have a good macro lens and a good light kit, you can get some pretty high resolution scans with cameras, but scanners are just, they're a little bit easier. You can just put them on the flatbed and press scan at a high resolution. So another drawback of cameras is, even though it's a positive, it's also a drawback. Sometimes it's battery powered, so you have to either keep it in hot wire the whole time, or you have to recharge your battery, which can be problematic. Also, the training, it takes quite a bit of training to get caught up to speed on photography of material. Scanner drawbacks, they are only capable of handling flat objects for the most part. There's only one angle available, it's horizontal, that's all you're gonna get. Otherwise, you're gonna start to get blurry objects, blurry images, I mean. They are also limited by the size of the glass. Another point I wanted to mention about that is you can stitch images together. If they do not fit completely on the flatbed surface, you can stitch them into multiple, you can scan them in multiple sections and stitch them together using Photoshop. And that's one of the techniques that we'll talk about later, because it does help, especially when you're limited to a smaller scanner and you don't have access to an overhead camera. Scratches on the glass is a big problem. That happens a lot with stapled material or paper clips, binding that you cannot remove. Sometimes they just will scratch your glass, and that's a costly repair, and it's time consuming. You usually have to ship it out. It's not something that's easy to do on your own. Yes, obviously they're not as portable, they're big and bulky. They do require to be plugged in, unlike the cameras, which can be battery powered. And I'm sure you all know they're very, very, very slow to scan, especially at high resolutions. Let's talk a little bit more about some scanning. Flatbed scanners, that we talked about a bunch of this stuff already. They're good for high resolution, good for flat, small objects. They can do negatives and slides if your scanner does have the sensor and the glass on both sides. They are low maintenance, easy to use, very slow, and they can damage books if you try to digitize books on them, if you try to flatten them, depending on the fragility of the item. So I just put a basic link at the bottom here. There's a scanning doc that I put together a while back that will get you through any kind of scanning, basic scanning. And these are some screenshots. This is the Epson Scan software that we use often in our studio at Florida State University. This is an updated version, but all of the features are still the same. And I use these images because you will see a lot of these same options on pretty much any scanning software you use. So your options here range from color, grayscale, black and white, depending on the material. We always recommend scanning directly in color because you can always desaturate and turn your images into black and white after the fact in post-production. So you can also set your resolution over here with screen and web, printer, other, you can set your own resolution. Here it's set to 400. That's typically our default for scanning objects, but it can go a lot higher. These scanners have 2400 optical resolution, which is what we would typically use for scanning film and negatives or anything teeny tiny. You have a lot of other options, image adjustments. We recommend not using them in most cases, just because the computers try to help by figuring out all this stuff automatically, and it typically gets it wrong. So your colors will look all wonky. They'll not be accurate, where we do want our images to look as accurate as possible. So we typically turn off any of the auto features that we see there. So yeah, we have our preview button that will allow you to see what is on the flatbed, which is this Arrested Development scan over here. It's just a DVD case from our collection. Nothing fancy, but it shows what it does. You have a preview screen, and then you will draw your little crop box and you'll scan it once you have your box drawn. From there, you can choose where you want the file to be saved. Usually it'll go to a dedicated folder. You can choose your file types as well. We, in the DLC, pretty much always scan as TIFFs, unless we are just creating some derivative copies or access copies for a one-off reproduction request. But if for anything going in the digital library, it's either going to be a TIFF or a high-res PDF. And we can talk about those files and those later on. So yeah, that's basic scanning. I do recommend checking out the document link at the bottom if you're interested in just getting up and running on some scanning. It's pretty basic, but it'll get you. It's good for using, good for training as well. So you can check that out. Right, we'll talk a lot more about scanning further on, but I want to jump to photography because that's typically the more complicated scenario. But yeah, we'll break all these things down further on. So photographic techniques. Let's see, what do we have there? Oh yes, that's our IQ180, our overhead camera that we use in the DLC, Digital Library Center. That is our workhorse equipment. We handle, that handles most of our digitization. Let's see, for digitizing books, we do use it a lot for books. Even though we do have a dedicated book scanner, we like to use the IQ180 overhead camera because it can handle oversized books. And it can also handle troublesome books with tight binding, where we have to digitize maybe one side at a time. So it is, you can use if you are digitizing books, and if it's not too fragile, if it's a newer book with good binding and you're not too concerned about the condition of it, you can use a large piece of glass to flatten the pages down so that you can shoot entire spreads at the same time. And you can crop those out later into individual pages if you want to display them in a book module or a book reader online. We, in a situation like this that you see on the image on the right, this book was too big to fit on our book scanner. So we had to use the IQ180. The binding was also tight, so we had to digitize one side at a time, even though we do have a dual camera setup with our ATEEZ camera, our ATEEZ Book Drive Pro. We decided to do one side at a time just to take care of the object. We didn't want to cause any damage to it. So we shot all of the odd pages first, and shooting every other page, and we set our file names to go to an increment of 2, so 1, 3, 5, and so on, all odd numbers. Once we digitize all of the odd pages, we flip over the book and we digitize it, doing the same thing on the even pages. And that works well. Once we combine all the images into the same folder, we are left with left and right pages of the book. It takes a little bit longer to shoot them individually, but the type of material that we work with in special collections and digital library center, we have a lot of rare books, and we want to make sure that we're taking care of that stuff. And this is one of the best ways to do it for us. Right, so let's see. Yes, dual cameras. You can capture left and right pages simultaneously, like I mentioned, with the attendees or any other book scanning setup. I have a few examples of some other book scanner setups. I'll show you some of those later. You can shoot books with 2 cameras tethered to a machine, or you can just do 1 camera overhead, like we did over here. There's lots of flexibility when digitizing books with camera setups. You can also use snake weights or wraps, sometimes fabric, to hold the pages up. In this page here, the image that I included in this example, we only have the front cover open. But once we got towards the end of the book, those pages were starting to fall down. Gravity was just doing its thing, and those pages just wanted to fall. So we did employ some wraps and some straps to hold the pages up, so that our hands weren't in the image the whole time. These cameras, the overhead cameras, are also good for oversized objects. You can use a stitching software if you can't fit it all in the same frame. If you don't have the option to zoom all the way out, or if the object is just too big, you can shoot it in multiple sections and stitch it together. We'll talk about the stitching feature a little bit later on. And using glass to keep them flat as well is a good handy feature. I'm not going to talk too much about lenses because that's a whole other presentation. But yes, different types of lenses: wide angle, normal, telephoto, and macro. We only, in our institution, recommend normal or macro lenses because those offer the least distortion of any of the lenses. Any wide angle lens that you use is going to have some curvature around the edges of the image, and it's going to distort whatever it is you're digitizing. So we don't recommend wide angle for this type of work that we do. It's not to say they don't have their purpose. They're great for product photography or architecture photography, landscape photography, all good for that stuff. Not so good for digitizing rare books or manuscript material. Telephoto lens, it's just a different type of lens, not anything that we would use in our studio, but I did want to show that they have a variety of different types of lenses. I would focus on normal and macro lenses if you are in the market for a camera setup for your material. Benefits of normal and macro. Normal lenses are good just because it's almost a one-to-one representation of what your eyes will see, especially the 50mm lens on a good camera will show basically what you're seeing with your eyes. So it's not going to be too much distortion. It's not going to be curving around the edges. It's not going to be zoomed in too much. So it's basically what you see is what you get with those. And macro lenses, on the other hand, they don't distort the image, but they do give you the benefit of zooming a lot closer. The focal range on macro lenses allows you to get right up close to the material that you're digitizing, and those are ideal for scanning negatives or film or anything that's just very small and you cannot put it on a flatbed. If you need to shoot it with a camera, I would recommend macro lenses. And there's just a little breakdown of the ranges of those lenses. I won't talk too much about those. Right, a quick example of macro. I'm sure it's obvious, but just in case. Regular normal lens on the left, a bowl of popcorn, not something that we shoot in our studio, but it does give a good visual representation. Macro lens, of course, the camera is all the way up to the kernels, to the popcorn, and as you can tell, it's in focus and you can get a much better, much closer up object. Whereas if you try to get that close with a normal lens, the lens just will not focus and you'll be left with a big soft blurry image, which is obviously something that we don't want. Sensors, again, I'm going to kind of go through this one quick because it might be outside the scope of this training, but I'd be happy to talk more about this individually if y'all want to reach out to me later. I love talking about cameras and scanning, so let's try to breeze through this. Okay, different types of sensors. If you're looking to purchase a camera, I recommend full frame when possible. They are more pricey, but they will give you way more data and way more pixels, and you can capture a lot more in a single shot than if you were using a crop sensor. The crop sensors will do exactly that. They will crop out what you see in the viewfinder of the camera. So it's you're losing a lot of data. It's just the way those lenses, those sensors work. So I don't recommend a crop sensor, but if you have it, you can make it work with a variety of lenses. And here's just another diagram of what a crop sensor versus a full frame sensor is looking like. Full frame sensor on the right side, you'll see the two images of the beautiful mountains. I don't know where that is, but it looks like something I'd love to visit. The crop sensor, obviously, is just cropping out a lot more of the clouds, of the sides, so you're not getting all of the data you want. And this is just an example from a Nikon crop sensor versus full frame sensor. Canons have the same thing. They also do have mirrorless cameras now, and they're a little bit different, but I'm not going to get into those today because that could be a whole other topic. All right, copy stands. Yes, there's a bunch of different types of copy stands for photography work, and you can spend a lot of money on them depending on what kind of features you need and what sizes of material you're working with. But that's not to say you cannot make your own. They do have DIY kits out there. You can build some of them. I'll show you some examples of that later on. But they do have their place in a studio if you have the space for them. This over here, that image on the right, is an image of Giselle, one of our co-workers. She was digitizing a Napoleon poster from a faculty member. It was an oversized object. It couldn't fit on the flatbed, so we had the copy stand set up, and we have our lights on the left and the right, so it's evenly lit. The camera can zoom up and down to move in and get as close as we need as far as the lens will let us focus. So that's the copy stand there. It's good for digitizing flat objects, book and film, especially if you have a light box to capture the film. Some of the cons are you are limited by the height of the stand or your ceiling. They also do take up a very large footprint in your studio. In most cases, something like this does, but you can build a smaller one if you need to be more portable. They do also have a very complex learning curve compared to flatbed scanning. And here are some of the examples of different types of DIY copy stands and other products that you can purchase from various vendors. These are pretty basic. They have Digital Transitions is one of the big vendors. They have some really high quality stuff. It's also very expensive. I think it is quality material, but I also realize that budgets do not always allow us to purchase that type of equipment. So I wanted to show that you can get images with a basic setup. It doesn't have to be anything too fancy. As long as you have a camera and some lights and some material, you can get some images, and you can get some pretty accurate results as long as you have a steady camera and some good lights. Speaking of lighting, there are two different types. Again, I won't talk too much because time is limited, but we have our continuous lighting, which is just your regular lights. They're on all the time. They can be very loud because they typically have fans to keep them cool. They do get very warm, so you might start sweating if you are too close to them, moving around the material. They do use more energy, and they are often less bright than strobes. Strobe lights or flashes, those are good. I recommend them if you need to have a lot of light, especially if you need to be portable. Those flashes and strobes can move around a lot easier than the big continuous lights. They're also much more quiet. They use less energy. And yeah, they are very good for a lot of material. They have the benefits and the cons, of course. The benefits of continuous lighting is that you can see what the object is looking like before you take the image. Whereas with the strobes, you kind of have to take a bunch of test shots to get your lighting and exposure correct. And I do have a link here about some lighting techniques. I'm not going to go into this, but that is a short video there that I recommend checking out. Raking light is something that is an interesting technique if you do need to show texture of an object for paintings or anything that might have some writing, or if you want to analyze warped or damaged areas. You can take a look at some of those features with raking light. And here's an example, left and right. So the left is just a regular shot taken with continuous lighting it's even lighting left and right sides, but raking light, if you turn off the light on one side, or if you block the light with any kind of flags or anything, you can get a lot more texture. Those shadows that pop up can give you some interesting results depending on what type of work and what type of material you are working with. So yeah, check out the video. It's interesting if you get a chance. One other thing to recommend is, to consider is room treatment, especially with photography when you have lights bouncing around the walls and the ceiling and the objects that you're digitizing. You want to make sure that you have the room treated as best as you can. And that means painting the walls and the ceilings. I realize that that's not always possible. It's just if you have the option and the budget and the time, then I recommend it. It will help you get more accurate images. So yeah, paint the walls neutral gray or black. Flat paint is important because we don't want the light to be bouncing back onto our images when we digitize them. Clothing, yeah, no hot pink, nothing too bright. Black or gray is good. Again, we don't want the light bouncing back onto the objects and casting any kind of awkward colors on the material. Right, and lighting, we recommend 5000K daylight lamps. You can fix this in post-production by using white balance, but it's good if you can get the lighting accurate up front, so there's less work to do in post-production. Also, if you have windows, I recommend getting blinds or curtains in there to eliminate any outside factors. Some things to look out for, we'll talk about some of these, is short focus. You want to make sure that your objects are focused, obviously. That not only applies to camera work, but with flatbed scanning, you can get out of focus scans, especially if you're digitizing or scanning anything with kind of depth. This happens sometimes with film or slides that are in film trays and carriers. So it's always good to zoom into your image or use a object level target, which I'll show you later on. That will give you an objective reference to see if your material is in focus or not. Yeah, reflections, you gotta look up for those. We have some examples of reflections that show up on objects. We were just digitizing some material the other day that we couldn't get out of a frame. It was a framed painting, I believe. And we were having some troublesome light reflections on the glass. So we had to get pretty creative with how we digitized that one. I believe what we ended up doing was just wrapping the camera to eliminate any reflections, because it's a shiny camera and the whole platform is pretty reflective. So we just wrapped it in some black felt and that took care of our reflections. But it's a whole host of issues that reflections can cause. Yeah, you want to make sure that your objects are flat, otherwise you might get out of focus issues when you have your peaks and your valleys in a wavy or wrinkled manuscript, for example. Tight binding is also another issue. You get some shadows in the binding. Also, text or writing in a diary, for example, can get lost in the gutters. If you're not able to disbind it, you might be in a bind. So yeah, I'll show you some examples of shadows and how you can get rid of those in the gutters as well. It's a pretty easy technique to eliminate shadows in the gutters, which it happens often. All right, yeah, also the auto features, please turn those off if you can. Although I will mention that autofocus is great. So keep autofocus on if you can, but everything else, auto exposure, auto color, any of those kind of things when scanning, I don't recommend them. But we can talk about those as well because there are some benefits to those. Right, focus check. I'll talk about this quick because I think we might have talked about this last time. Right, we scan an object, it's a manuscript. We have our object level target at the bottom there. We include that so that we can see if our camera or our scanner is actually scanning correctly and if it's in focus. If that's in focus, then that means our paper and our material is in focus. That helps because, especially with photography work, it's hard for us to tell, sorry, let me back up. If we are digitizing film or a printed photograph, it's not always clear if the original photographer was in focus or if it's our equipment. And that's why we include these object level targets into our scans, because if we know that is in focus. Those are built just for that purpose. So we can focus on those lines. And if it's sharp, then our image should be sharp. If not, we're going to zoom in and you can tell right away that this is a little soft. That little segment there in the middle is soft. And some of these things you can only tell when you zoom in. So I recommend zooming in to 100% of the image, because if you're zoomed all the way out to see the whole object, you might not be able to tell these little details. You might not be able to detect an out of focus object. So yeah, flattening them helps. If you have a big gold piece of glass, you can get more plexiglass or anything like that you can flatten the object with. That helps. And that's particularly important with cameras. Not so much of an issue with flatbed scanners. Right, reflections. Yeah, so these two images on the right side, I'm not sure if you can see it. I do have a zoomed in version later, I'll show you. But the image on the left, that one is good. That one doesn't have any reflections on it, or at least they are minimized. The one on the right, you can see right where it says Ringling, right by the L-I-N-G, there's some little highlights there. Those are not on the actual book, but those were from some overhead lights that we had in the studio. So we had to, we just had to cover up those lights. We've since got the lights removed because they were causing too much of a problem. Those overhead lights were just too shiny, they were chrome, and they were reflecting onto the objects below it. So this book was a good example of why we needed to get rid of those lights. So yeah, you can adjust the light source. You can adjust the angle of the light. Sometimes that helps get rid of reflections. Changing the camera location is also a good way to do it if you have the ability to do so. Sometimes the copy stands are too big to move, so you're kind of stuck there. Blocking overhead lights, that's something that we employed for this one. A light box or diffuser, those can help a lot. I think we have some examples later on in the presentation. We can talk about those too. Or if worse comes to worse, and if you have an object that's small enough, you can use it on a flatbed scanner, and that should get rid of all reflections. And here's just a zoomed in version. Subtle reflections on the right, nice and clear on the left. All right, tight binding, right, in books, this occurs in photography more often when you have two light sources on either side of the object, but it can occur in flatbed situations as well. If you were to plop a book down on a flatbed, the light is coming from one angle, so you might have to rotate the book just to get rid of it. But you can clearly see the image on the left has a significant gutter shadow, and luckily, this book has some pretty good margins, so none of the text is getting lost. But if the book is pretty thick and if the binding is very tight, you're definitely going to lose some text along the way eventually. It happens to us all the time in the DLC. And when that happens, we just rotate the book 90 degrees and that takes care of the issue. So we don't have any more shadows. The light source is going up and down the book instead of across it. And that solves that problem. So some other things to look out for. We mentioned disabling the auto features. That includes auto exposure, color, definitely auto flash, auto white balance. We typically want to turn that off because we want to set that on our own. I usually take off auto sharpen as well, auto lighting optimizer, all of these sorts of things. These can be found on cameras themselves, but they can also be found in scanning software. So Sometimes they work, but in my experience, they often cause more trouble than they are worth. So I like to eliminate all of these, and then I take care of it in post-production or in some editing software later on. Autofocus, yes, autofocus is great. Right, so let's briefly talk about some different types of material and see, we got about maybe 10 minutes or so. All right, types of material: reflective, transmissive. Reflective is just anything paper, anything opaque that light is bouncing off of. Transmissive is anything that light is shining through. So film, slides, negative, transparencies, and microfilm. So let's talk about some of those. Scrapbooks, a type of reflective material. I don't know if y'all have digitized scrapbooks or attempted to, but they definitely can be a thorn in the side of any digital archivist or photographer. They are tricky. The example I have down there is a full spread from one of our scrapbooks in our special collections. This is a very good example of a scrapbook. All the photos are neatly tucked in, and they're tight, and they're not loose, not sliding around. There's no envelopes with letters. There's no newspapers that need to be unfolded. There's no weird stuff in there, like locks of hair, bugs, who knows what else. Yeah, we find lots of strange stuff in in scrapbooks. So overhead cameras are preferred when digitizing scrapbooks, at least in our experience, because several reasons. They typically are oversized, that's one of the reasons, but mostly we like to see what it is we're digitizing, because a lot of these objects do get loose. A lot of our scrapbooks are very old, and there's a lot of material that's just been kind of stuck in there, and they are just sliding around the pages. So if we attempt to put the page down, face down on a flatbed scan, there's no way for us to ensure that it's going to be straight by the time we're ready to scan. Things get shifted in that whole process. So it's great if you can shoot it overhead with a camera, and then you could just put a piece of glass on it to flatten it, if that's an option. Removing the binding is one of the best ways to get a good high quality image of a scrapbook. It's easier for digitizing them on flatbeds because you don't have to put a whole book on there, but it does help a lot with overhead cameras as well, because you just have one single page that isn't trying to curve in the gutters, and it just helps to have individual pages. If you can bind them, that helps a lot. Loose photos and inserted material, they have books within books. Yeah, a lot of them have brochures, graduation ceremony programs, all those sorts of things, invitations. So we'll talk about how we digitize those sorts of things. Yeah, bugs in hair and all sorts of strange stuff. We've seen lots of strange stuff in there. There is no right way to digitize scrapbooks. Every institution might have a different way of doing it, and that's absolutely fine, because yeah, they're just a different beast when compared to our traditional material, just like regular bound printed books or manuscript material or photographs. Yeah, we typically display them in a book reader module. So we, in Digital, our digital online repository, we have them so that you can look through the pages and you could flip through them virtually, left and right. Typically that works great in a regular book, but with scrapbooks, since there are so many inserts and multiple pages within pages, it throws off the order of all of them. So you're not looking at left and right anymore. It's just whatever you can find. So we scan them. This left image here is an example of where we had some newspaper clippings that were glued down on top of each other. So we had to take multiple images. We would take first image of the page as we saw it, and then we would flip up the other newspaper clippings to get the pages below. So that increased the page count immediately. And over there on the right side, we just have some, it looks like a little bouquet of pressed flowers. I'm sure it looked really nice at one point, but over time, yeah, luckily that one was in an envelope, so that was easier to digitize, but a lot of times they are just loose and they can be brittle, so it's good to be careful when digitizing those. We typically We'll digitize them as a full page first, and then we will go in and digitize the individual objects as well. So here you can see a Thanksgiving page from one of our scrapbooks. And you can see on the left side, left page, we have a lot of different things. We have some turkeys, some napkins, a little pumpkin with like, I don't know what that is on there, just some names on it. We also have this thing on the top right. It's a tiny Thanksgiving Day, 1923, something or other. It's got a few pages in it. So we digitized the main page as we saw it on the left, and then we zoom in to that object and we crop that one individually so that the user can interact with it on its own. So some of the objects that we encounter when digitizing material is artifacts. We have a lot of glossy and shiny material especially with artifacts. Anything ceramic or glass is going to be slightly problematic depending on your lighting situation. We can employ 3D scanners. That's becoming more and more common. We do not use them in our institution. That's not to say we are not going to do it soon in the near future, but for now we are strictly photography based. So for artifacts, we will either put the objects on a Lazy Susan and we'll spin it around to get multiple angles of the same object, and those angles, front, left, top, bottom, all in between, those will be uploaded to Diginol to be viewed. So it doesn't have the interactive 3D experience, but you do get to see pretty much all of the objects. When digitizing glossy objects and artifacts, there's a few techniques that you can use. Then that includes different lighting techniques like diffused lights, softbox, reflectors, bouncing light, shoot-through umbrellas, and pillowcases. That one is something you could do without breaking the bank. Just get a thin sheet, or it doesn't have to be a pillowcase, but it's easy because it's already enclosed. You can put the object in it and shoot the light directly through it. And the pillowcases are usually thin enough that enough light gets through to get a nice evenly lit object. It's kind of like shooting a portrait on a sunny day versus shooting something on a cloudy day. You'll notice the lighting is a little bit more even on a cloudy day, and that's what we're trying to recreate with these soft boxes, pillowcases, diffused light. Another example, this is us in the Digital Library Center digitizing one of the very few Napoleon death masks in existence, and it was very reflective. So in that middle shot, you can see that we used a little bounce card / flag to block the light from one side and to just give it a little bit more even appearance. So there weren't so many hot spots on poor Napoleon's forehead. And on the right side is the resulting image, which is a lot more even than what we would have got without any lighting techniques. And here's just another basic demonstration of what we did for that Napoleon death mask. The left one is a picture of a lamb, I think, with direct flash on it, with no other treatment. But using the bounce cards, you can get a much more even image on the right. And there's a little setup on the right side there. Okay, let's see, paper material, oversized objects. You can zoom out if you are using a camera-based setup. You can stitch multiple images together using photo merge in Photoshop, and we can talk about that as well later on. I did include some links below from Towns Web Archiving there in the UK, and they have some really good documentation if you want to read up some more about how to digitize problematic and oversized items like these. That's a gigantic something they're scanning. I'm not sure what it is, but that one is something that you would have to stitch in multiple sections and bring it into Photoshop to join them. Wrinkled or curled pages, you will usually want to flatten those with glass. If it's too big for a flatbed scanner, you can get custom made tempered glass and non-reflective glass, glare reduction glass that can help flatten these. A lot of the copy stands these days will come with these built in, so you have a piece of glass, kind of a platform that you can raise up and down as needed to flatten the objects that you're digitizing. And we're going to quickly talk about some film scanning. And I realize we're coming up on time here shortly, so we'll talk about this pretty briefly. I think we're getting close to the end. So film, right. Film can be done on both flatbeds and on camera setups. Scanning film, we recommend on flatbeds to use the highest resolution possible, highest optical resolution possible. So on our Epson expressions, it's 2400 ppi, which doesn't really get us up to the standards we would like, but that's the highest optical resolution that that scanner can utilize. Anything higher than that is just interpolated, and it's basically just zooming in on the image, which can be pixelated. So we do always use film carriers or trays. In that top right image, you can kind of see there's a lot of slides, color positive slides they're shooting. Each of those are placed into a grid. It's a tray that you can keep them nice and neat, and that helps a lot when cropping and getting the high-res images from the actual scan. We do also recommend using a object level transparency target, like the one in the bottom right. That helps when doing color corrections later on. It also helps with focus issues that we talked about earlier. One thing to note about scanning film, but specifically negatives and positive film, is you want the emulsion side down. It's not to say you can't fix that in post-production, but it does give you a slightly better image. You can flip them in Photoshop or any other editing software later on. When you do get your images in the scan, you want to look for logos or text or anything that can confirm your image was faced the correct way, because they can get flipped and you'll have to correct those later on if needed. And with a camera setup, it's a lot different. We will need to employ the use of a light box. Those can be built as well for low cost, but they also have a ton of different ones that you can purchase from different vendors. But you do need a macro lens. That's very important. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get the lens close enough to focus to get the resolution that you need. So a macro lens and a light box, film carriers are all essential when photographing film, and also a very steady camera and a very steady platform is important, because at that level of zoom and that level of resolution, any slight movement or shake or a train driving by your house is going to give you a blurry image. File management, we're going to talk about this real quick. Different file types, master and derivatives. Those are relatively self-explanatory. So master files are going to be the highest resolution ones. Derivatives are typically the ones that you will deliver to your researcher or patron. And that's all I've got to say about that for now, since we are coming up on time. Sorry about that. Again, I would love to talk to y'all more about this later on if you want to shoot me an email or give me a call. So yeah, let's move on to post-processing. And here come these color targets again, the reference targets. We use these to calibrate monitors, but also just to get good, accurate results from our images. Input resolution, output resolution. These ones, I'm not going to talk too much about those. Those you can set on your scanner software. The input resolution is what you tell the scanner to scan at. So 400 ppi, 2400 ppi. Output resolution is what you save the image as. So once you have the image, you can save it at whatever resolution you want, depending on what images you're working with, what resolution you're working with. So let's take a look at some stitching really quick as we go into post-production or post-processing, what we call. They are good for oversized objects. Photoshop has the photo merge feature. You can Google it. There's a ton of videos on it that will show you how to use it. It's very accurate. The newest version of it does a really good job of seamlessly joining multiple scans together. And the cropping software, I do want to touch on this because we've been playing around with this one a lot more since the last presentation that I gave. And I'm extremely hopeful and impressed with these results that I'm getting. Scan Tailor Advanced, I include some links at the bottom for you to go and check them out. It's all open source and free. It does a really good job with auto cropping, straightening, auto page split. This is stuff that does help later on. I know I don't talk much about very highly of auto features, but in post-production, these features, cropping and straightening, it does take a lot of the time out of our production. So it speeds things up quite a bit. I recommend taking a look at Scan Tailor if you're looking for some software options. And here's just a quick example of stitching. This is an oversized map in our collections. It was too big even for our IQ180 overhead camera, so we had to shoot it in 2 sections. We shot the left and then we moved the image so that we can get the right side. And we had 2 separate images, and long story short, Photoshop just joined them together, and voila, we have one single seamless image. It'll typically join it in the middle, or Photoshop will find the path of least resistance to join the images together. And file naming, just briefly, we have file naming conventions. At the end of this presentation, I have a link to our imaging guidelines, and that includes all of our file naming guidelines as well. So I recommend taking a look at that if you are curious about file naming and file management. So we want them to show the location of the original objects, and we don't want to have any special characters in there, no spaces, none of that. Those will cause problems when uploading. And I'm going to have to run through these pretty quick. So here's an example of digital library file naming. So our file names typically begin with FSU, FSU MSS, or HUA, depending on what type of material or what collections we're working within. And that allows us to track the file back to the original location in our stacks, in our collection. So if somebody or researcher downloads a file for whatever project they're working on, say they're downloading a ton of material, if they just have those images in a folder, they're not going to know necessarily where they came from. If they need to find them again, the file names will help lead the researchers and the staff back to the objects if we need them. There's an example of a book that we use, PR 4334. We just include that call number in the file name, so we know exactly where to find that image or that book on the shelf. Same thing for boxed material, manuscript material. We include the box number, folder number, and the item number if applicable. And same thing with file negatives and film material. We include as much information as possible so we can track them down. And here's some resources, including that bottom link has our FSU Special Collections link, which has a lot of our documentation for file management and guidelines. And I believe that's all. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I had to run through that one really quick. If we have to do a part 3, I'd be happy to do so. But I would also love to hear from y'all if you want to reach out to me individually. You can shoot me an email at any time, and I will gladly give you a call. We could set up a meeting and we can talk about your specific situations. So with that being said, thank you so much. Any questions that I can answer before we call it a day?
And please feel free to add your questions to the chat box. And while we're formulating those questions, if you have just a moment to fill out our poll, please do so. You'll also have the opportunity to fill out the survey after the session. We'll include a link in the email that we send. So yeah. Thank you, Stuart, so much for your presentation. I thought that was very useful. When you're doing a multi-page object, how do you make sure to keep the file names for the pages straight? Do you just add the page number at the end? Right.
Yes. Yeah. So we typically will use leading zeros at the end of each file. So yeah, if we're digitizing, say, a folder in a box, for example, a bunch of manuscript material, we will digitize it from start to finish. And yeah, each file, it will start with 001, for example. Let me go back here real quick. Yeah, so here's a just a book object. It starts with page 1 for the cover, 001, 002 for the inside cover, and so forth. And it ends at page 120 or however many pages you have. And most pieces of software will automatically add those numbers. And you can tell it to add how many zeros, or if you want to add letters instead of numbers, you can do that as well. So yeah, anything like that will work. And if you are digitizing them as individual left and right pages for a book, as long as you're shooting them with an increment of 2, so 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, 6, and so on, they will all fall in place, and you'll have a full set by the end.
How does it work with, like, you gave a great example of a scrapbook that had like a book within a book. So how do you handle those kinds of objects?
Oh man, Kayla, yeah, scrapbooks. Yeah, those are a pain. They're beautiful objects. I love working with them, but digitizing them is so hard. So yes, we will try our best to digitize it, just as we would a normal book. So each page gets its own image. But yeah, when we come up to something with an envelope or a brochure, we will scan that first page as we come across it. So it'll be the full page with everything on it, but then we will crop down to the individual object on the page. If it's a brochure, we'll crop everything else out, and we will crop those individual pages as well, which will typically be presented just in consecutive order. We don't usually do anything fancy with it because we have not found a good way of digitizing scrapbooks. We've been searching and no luck. So yeah, it gets kind of messy, but there's no right way to do it. And I would love to hear if anybody else has any solutions to that. But no, that's kind of how we do it.
Okay. Well, if no one else has any additional questions, we can go ahead and end today. And I just want to thank Stuart again for sharing his expertise. And please do feel free to reach out to Stuart or myself if you have any additional questions or if you have additional feedback about the session. So thank you everybody for attending today, and I hope you have a great week.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, y'all have a good week, good weekend and all that, and stay safe.